Okay, so I made that 7 p.m. So we'll get started. So welcome to the webinar, everyone. I I'm James Baker. I'm org's program manager for looking at kind of work around platform power and free expression. And what we're doing tonight, we're giving you a briefing on the data use and access bill. We've got a really exciting panel who we're going to hear from, hear some presentations from all of them, then a chance for some Q&A at the end of that. But before I get started on that, I realised that today to the date is exactly a year since we last did a briefing. So on the 19th of February 2024, we're here discussing a previous government bill under a different administration, and that was called the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill. So here we are a year later. We've got a bill, maybe similar to the last bill in many ways, but there has been some changes which we'll learn about tonight. And we've got a new administration now. So, some of us may comment that governments come and go, but the agenda, the agendas stay the same. But what we'll hear about from the panel in a bit is what changes there have been in the bill, what the debates are about it, and hopefully you'll find it an interesting evening where you'll learn a little bit more about it. We have got, I think chat should be open. We've got Pam here on the call as well, who's the kind of mysterious dot you may see, but Pam is there to answer questions in chat and kind of post information back to it as well. And hopefully everyone can hear it fine and all of that stuff. If not, then you'll be able to pick it up again on the YouTube recording of it. So what I'll do first of all, I'll get on to some introductions of the panel. So first off, we've got Mariano. If you want to say hello, Mariano.
Hi, everyone.
So Mariano works for us at org. He is one of our policy leads. He's been working really closely on the data protection on the data use access bill. He's been kind of writing all our briefings on it. We've then also got Hope on the call.
Hi.
Want to say hi, Hope. So Hope works for the Forefront Project. So she's a youth worker and community organizer, and she's currently leads the build team at the Forefront Project, and is active in kind of grassroots movements on policing, borders, education. We've also got Caroline Selman on the call.
Hello.
Caroline works for the Public Law Project, and I've been working with Caroline with the different civil society groups on the bill. And Caroline is a real expert on the bill, in particular, some of the provisions around automated decision making and the kind of role of AI in government in our lives. So I have Caroline on the call. And then last but not least, we've got Martin from Keep Our NHS Public. So if Keep Our NHS Public, it's a non-party political organisation. It campaigns against the privatisation and underfunding of the NHS. And they've got a data working group that works around all the issues around how our kind of NHS data is used by government. So looking forward to hearing from Martin later. So each of the speakers, I've tasked them to talk for roughly 10 minutes. They can go on a little bit, hopefully give you a good overview of the bill. And then at the end of that, we'll take questions from everyone on Zoom, and hopefully we'll have a good chance to get through as many questions as possible. So that's enough of me talking. I'll now hand over to our first speaker, which is Mariano.
Thank you, James, and hi, everyone. My name is Mariano Delisanti. I'm a legal and policy officer at Open Rights Group. And yeah, I mean, I guess I've been working on the data protection bill before it existed, really, at the point when Open Rights Group was kind of starting to scan the horizon, and we saw Dominic Cummings starting to voice concerns around the idiotic GDPR, as he called it at the time, and something that stood in the way of his vision of turning the government into a startup where people burn out and where everybody goes bankrupt every couple of years, I suppose. We then went, through the legislative process and the Data Protection Digital Information Bill, version 1 and 2. Michelle Donnellan saying that the GDPR was the reason we have a shortage of plumbers in the United Kingdom, and therefore this was going to be solved by deregulating data protection, data protection. And finally, we get to the Data Access and Use Bill from the Labour government. And well, I mean, I guess the headline is where the UK data protection reform has always been a very long list of very bad ideas. The list has grown a little shorter now. Labor has taken away several aspects that were problematic, like the watering down of data subject rights, so your right to access for your information or to rectify them and so forth. They've also taken away the changes around the accountability regime, so the let's say the documentation process that organizations need to put in place to make sure that what they're doing with their data can be scrutinized by third parties and most importantly by authorities. They have taken away changes that would have given the powers to the Secretary of State to issue a statement of strategic priorities to the Information Commissioner Office, and several other things, let's say, but I guess these are the main aspects which are of interest to us. Fortunately, a lot of problematic issues still persist. And I guess a good starting point about this is the changes around artificial intelligence and automated decision making. This maybe doesn't come as a surprise if you're following the digital rights policy of the Labour government, since the government has gone into this mad crusade of putting mainlining artificial intelligence into the veins of the UK, whatever this means. And part of this goes through the Data Use and Access Bill, where there are being introduced changes to Article 22 of the UK GDPR. Article 22 is an article that gives you the right not to be subject to automated decision making unless you either give your consent to this, or unless you enter a valid contract that requires the use of this automated tool in order to be executed, or finally, unless there is fundamentally a law that authorizes this. So the headline is this is a clause that was supposed to promote what is a voluntary adoption of new technologies, right? I mean, like we can deploy this only if you consent to this, or if there has been a democratically taken decision that this kind of system can be used in this kind of context. The Data Use and Access Bill will reduce these, so restrict the scope of this right only to decisions which are taken based on sensitive characteristics like trade union membership or health data and so forth. And they would also empower the Secretary of State to exempt any automated system from those provisions in any case at their discretion. Other changes which are being introduced in this regard, I can also point out to a blog that Chris Pounder in the Hamburg talk has done on this regard, is the reduction of so the introduction of several limitations to the right to have access to personal data in certain circumstances, or the obligation to inform individuals when data are collected or shared in large quantities, and most importantly, not at their source. So like here we're talking about the further sharing of data. And the bottom line is, I mean, this is problematic from several different perspectives, but it becomes more problematic in the field of artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence is a technology that fundamentally doesn't work. And this means that you can't really access the data that you ingest in an AI system. You can't really correct them. You can't really exercise a lot of the rights that the GDPR gives to you. And by introducing those exemptions or watering down those provisions, what fundamentally happens is that you're shielding AI companies from the need to answer to a subject access request, or to informing individuals that they have collected data about themselves and that they are used this to train an artificial intelligence model. So this is the first topic of today. The second one very quickly goes into powers of the Secretary of State. We mentioned already one about artificial intelligence, but there are more. And they go into things like making designating data uses which are always legal, or further use of data. So data which has been collected from you for one reason and can be reused for a different reasons than the one it was collected before, that again would be made legal. Today, it's generally speaking illegal to do this. We have other powers to reduce safeguards around the use of data for research, archiving, or statistical purposes. And then we have some more ominous powers that go into fundamentally issuing designation notices or joint intelligence operations notices that go into fundamentally taking some data processing or data collection, which has been done for law enforcement purposes, say, policing and so forth, and basically exempting them from the application of the GDPR to draw them into the Investigatory Power Act, which is the legislation that is in place for surveillance by intelligence agencies for reason of national security, counterterrorism, and so forth. And the problem with these provisions is, of course, that they make it a lot easier to collect a lot of data for reasons of fundamentally public security and surveillance, and they make it also a lot easier to bring them to a legislation where accountability, transparency, and potential for redress is very low. Finally, at least for, let's say, the topics that we are going to discuss today, I will mention the changes to the Information Commissioner Office. We mentioned before that the government has dropped some of the proposals that were advanced in the previous by the Conservatives, in particular the one about issuing a statement of strategic priority. However, they are still going to, let's say, change the structure of the ICO to one of a corporation where you have a board of executive non-executive members that fundamentally supervises and set the direction, and then you have an executive board, which is an executive committee, which is the people who implement this. The board, so the people who set the direction, will be a committee that is designated entirely from the government, so without any guarantee of, let's say, independence or arm's length from the government. And at this point, we can also say without any guarantee of concerning the potential removal of these people, because this is the same structure that the Competition and Market Authority has. And as you may have known from the news, very recently, the government decided to oust the chair of the Competition and Market Authority because he was investigating Amazon and Microsoft and a lot of people that the government likes. And because they thought that this was bad for growth, they decided to get rid of the authority instead. And now we don't have an antitrust regulators any longer in the UK, which is a lot of fun. This, I mean, it's kind of unlikely to happen with the ICO because the ICO is already very aligned with the government in, let's say, supporting big tech and what they're doing. You might have learned, for instance, that the ICO issued a response to a letter from the government about how they were promoting growth by boasting that the ICO is not enforcing the law against Microsoft, against Meta, and so forth. And because of this, Meta is able to roll out new products faster than in the EU, in the UK. The product is talking about is artificial intelligence, of course, and it goes into a complaint that Open Rights Group has made against the reuse of personal data from the Facebook platforms for training artificial intelligence, which is so far stopped in the European Union, but was authorized in the UK by the Information Commissioner Office. So, having given this, let's say, landscape of what the ICO is today, yes, we do have the changes where the, let's say, the grip of the government toward the ICO is even stronger than before. We also have a watering down of the statutory objective. Today, you might say that the law imposes the ICO to protect personal data. In the future, the primary objective of the ICO will be promoting the responsible use of data, and then there will be a number of secondary objectives like promoting innovation, promoting competition, promoting national security, and other, let's say, priorities. So fundamentally, it becomes very difficult to say what the ICO is there to do, and therefore it becomes very, very easy for the ICO not to do anything in the end. And yes, I mean, I guess these are the main issues that, as Open Rights Group, we do have about this bill. I will just mention briefly the last issue here, which is the adequacy, the adequacy with the European Union. As you might know, an important aspect in the relationship between the EU and the UK is that the European Union has recognized that the UK does provide an adequate level of protection under the EU GDPR due to the fact that the law is at the moment pretty much the same. However, I mean, some of the things that we have just mentioned already start to show how our reassessment of the decision, which is due in June this year, might be problematic. One of the key criteria for adequacy is the independence of the ICO. We saw how, let's say, the Labour government has kind of blown away the concept of independent regulatory authorities in the UK, as they have given themselves the authority of removing the regulators that don't do what the government says. And together with this, also, we do have a freedom of information request where the ICO has disclosed that in the year 2024, they acted upon only 1 out of 25,800 and more complaints that they received from the public. So in terms of the right to lodge a complaint and the right to seek redress in the UK being also a key criteria for adequacy with the European Union, the fact that essentially this right doesn't exist in practice because you do a complaint and it doesn't work is, of course, a problem. And finally, we go to the powers of the Secretary of State, which, of course, give the government wide discretionary power to punch holes in the GDPR. And this means that any minister could come out with a very funny idea about, I don't know, doing surveillance for some reasons and so forth, and with this breaking the adequacy determination. So let's say if you look at this at the situation in the UK, and if you look at how the law is evolving and the powers that will be given to the government, I think it's fair to say that let's say the adequacy status of the UK is short-lived. And with this, I stop also because I think I've gone a little beyond, and I'll give it back to the floor.
Great. Thank you so much, Mariano, for that overview. Lots of different issues there, touching upon ICO and the kind of failings there. We get a lot with people's casework, e-adequacy, covering changes in the bill from last time, powers of the Secretary of State, and a little bit on automated decision making. So thanks so much for that overview. What I'm going to do, I'm going to go on to Nick's panelists now, kind of keep it moving at a pace, and then give us hopefully lots of time for Q&A at the end. So over to Hope Nix.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mariana, for that introduction. I guess I'll go a bit more in depth into some of the elements of the bill that are in relation to the work I do, which is generally around law enforcement and policing. So I work with a lot of young people who are impacted by policing in the criminal legal system. And I guess I'll talk a bit about how, yeah, the bill might impact people already targeted by policing and the wider criminal legal system. So the police are already able to collect a lot of data on the public, and they store data from different places. So whether that's from crime reports, from data that's freely offered up by the public, from their own so-called intelligence, and lots of other data that's kind of accessed, increasingly shared through other government services, the immigration system, also local councils, schools, NHS, etc. So the police have access to a lot of data. And as we kind of touched on earlier around GDPR, so this regulation kind of puts restrictions onto how data can be legally shared. And generally, one of the considerations around the use of data is in line with, what a person who shared that data would reasonably think it could be used for. So that's the legitimate expectations of the individual whose data is being processed about what that data would be processed and used for. So in the bill, in this upcoming bill, Schedule 4 and 5 would essentially remove the requirement for someone's legitimate expectation to be considered if it is for the purpose of things like national security, crime detection, crime prevention, safeguarding, or answering a request made by a public authority. And this is concerning for a few reasons. for anyone generally who cares about their right to their own data, but also particularly for people who are already subject to extensive police harassment and harm by the police. So that might be Black and brown communities, working class people, people with precarious immigration status, sex workers, Gypsy, Roma, traveller communities, and the list kind of goes on. But I'll go into a bit more detail about why this might be concerning, particularly around the use of terms like national security and safeguarding. So these are things that are often open to interpretation by the police and we regularly see them used as covers for different types of police activity. So we've seen over the last few years protesters regularly detained and charged under anti-terrorism laws. Also things like the prevent duty, which is supposedly anti-radicalization, which basically is often used around young people, also used in hospitals, different public spaces, where people's information can be used and criminalized based on suspicions that they may be involved or vulnerable to radicalization. We see that used a lot against children, particularly Muslim children, and this all comes under national security. So similarly with safeguarding, we see this often used as a way to access and store information against young people, and people who are generally considered vulnerable. So an example is a police database like the Gangs Matrix and other similar gangs databases that are supposedly storing information on people who are suspected to be gang members, though databases like the Gangs Matrix have been found to disproportionately profile and criminalize young Black men. And these databases don't only store information on people who are suspected of committing crimes, but also people who are suspected of being victims of crimes. And in these situations, things like safeguarding are used as a guise for protection and how the police are interacting with them for protection purposes. But we can see that in putting their data under this kind of heading of safeguarding, there is a much more ability to share it and access it for ways that the police want to use it. Similarly, there are other examples like the Think Family Education app in Bristol, which is a collaboration between schools and Bristol Council and Avon and Somerset Police. And here again, we saw that this term safeguarding was used as a way to access information about young people in schools where they should be safe and looked after. And they were again instead profiled and surveilled. So these are some examples of how the kind of terminology like national security and safeguarding is kind of used specifically around data as a way for police to gain more access. And this bill will essentially extend the access to that data for police services. And I guess going on to another clause in the bill that is particularly related to law enforcement is clause 81, which speaks about the logging of law enforcement processing. So currently, if an officer wants to access any information on a police database, they have to log a reason for accessing it. And that should be a proper policing purpose for doing so, not just because they were interested in the case or something like that. But clause 81 removes this requirement to log that reason. The government have claimed it will help free up police time and avoids unnecessary admin. But essentially, it shows a focus on making the police's lives easier at the cost of what little accountability mechanisms we currently have within the police. So for many, this is concerning in and of itself. It's very hard for police communities to get recourse to any sort of justice around harm caused by the police. And there are very few accountability checks in reality that exist within policing anyway. But I think combined with the increase in data access powers, this feels like a move in the wrong direction when it comes to limiting police's power to do harm. There have been recent reports of police officers using databases to stalk members of the public. And last year, there was several officers faced a disciplinary charge for accessing case files about the murder of Sarah Everard by Officer Wayne Cousins in 2021. They're just a couple of examples of how information on police databases has and is used by police officers for non-policing purposes, and that doesn't include the harm that's caused by accessing people's data that is technically seen as policing purposes. So I think that that's just a couple of cases that we know about. We're not really sure how many more other examples of this that aren't flagged. And given the ever increasing access of data that the police and other public services have access to, I would say that anytime there is legislation around police access to technology, it should really be to put restrictions on how much the police can access rather than making it easier for them to access our data when and how they choose to. So I think, yeah, given the countless examples of the ways that police have harmfully used data and used it in discriminatory ways, again, particularly usually impacting racialized Black and brown working class communities, then, I think when we're looking at how we're legislating around police's access, we need to recognize that, police databases always seem to disproportionately capture and criminalize racialized people. Police's access to tech seems to do the same generally. So we really need to be pushing against this rather than seeing legislation that makes it easier for police to profile and criminalize marginalized members of the public. Sorry, that wasn't a particularly jolly roundup of the bill, but I hope that was helpful. And yeah, happy to answer any questions afterwards.
Thank you so much, Hope. It's really, I think, useful to hear about how this bill kind of impacts some of those marginalized communities. And, to me, I think it's just shocking after last year we had that case with police officers being sacked for wrongly accessing a record, but they'd then just changed the law like that to make it so they don't even have to give a reason. I mean, how long does it take an officer to type in one sentence as to why they're accessing a record? It doesn't seem that much to ask. That basic kind of login is something most of us have to do at work on databases. So to remove that from the police at the same time, as you say, giving them more access to information, I think is going to be pretty alarming for a lot of those communities who kind of feel like they're over policed by certain police forces in the country. So thanks so much for that really valuable contribution to the evening. Next up, and we'll have Q&As at the end. So if people have got questions, hold that for, and we'll have a good chance of those at the end. Next up, we've got Caroline from the Public Law Project.
Hi, and I've got slides, so I'm just going to hopefully share those. Yeah, can people see that okay?
Yeah, we can see it. I think if you just start the slide scroll, it'll go full screen then, yeah.
Yeah, give me a sec, sorry. For some reason it's not doing the slideshow. Okay. Is it all right if I just keep it on this bit? Can people see it okay?
Yeah, no, I can see that. I can see that fine. I think others can as well. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I'm Caroline Selman. I'm from the Public Law Project. We are sort of part law firm, part researchers and policy people. And one of the areas we work on is round about the public body use of automation, particularly in decision making. And the bit that I'm going to be talking about today in relation to the bill are the changes that are being made in the bill to some of the legal provisions that currently apply to automated decision making. So as people on the call are probably increasingly aware, automated algorithms and AI are increasingly being used to make decisions that would traditionally have been made about us by human beings. One of the things Public Law Project's developed is something called the Tracking Automated Government Register, which is a database of all the automated decision-making tools that we've become aware of in different ways. And there's about 75 tools that we've currently got on that register, but that's probably the tip of the iceberg. And we know that there's a desire across government and outside of the government and private sector as well to make increasing use of automated decision-making tools. And those kind of tools potentially bring some benefits, but they also bring lots of risks as well. And I think sometimes something which is also sometimes lost when we talk about these things is that it also represents quite a fundamental shift in the way that some of the important decisions are being taken about us. And one of the challenges is that the existing legal frameworks that we have been designed with human decision makers in mind, and they need to evolve and adapt in order to keep pace with that changing way of making decisions. But unfortunately, government has shown limited appetite to date to update legal frameworks. Common law, so judge-made law, is developing slowly due to lots of issues, particularly around about transparency, which means it's difficult for people to know about problematic decisions and challenge them. And there hasn't been much appetite to legislate. But what's concerning is that through the current data use and access bill, is that what is happening is that that will weaken one of the few existing legal protections that we have, and that's Article 22 of UK GDPR. And I think, just to put it on the record, I don't think we think, and lots of people don't think, that Article 22 is perfect, but it's one of the few legislative safeguards that we currently have. And it's concerning that that's currently being weakened without thinking about how the legislative framework can, what would replace it and how to deal with the changing decision-making situation that we currently have. So a bit of background as to what Article 22 is. So under Article 22 currently, as Mariano was setting out a bit at the beginning, currently people have a right not to be subject to solely automated decision-making, which has a legal or similarly significant effect, unless it's subject to contract, authorised by law, and or subject to explicit consent. And solely automated decision-making isn't something that's currently defined in the legislation, but there is well-accepted guidance that basically means where there's decisions being made with no meaningful human involvement, so where decisions are being taken about us entirely by a computer. And one of the other things that UK GDPR currently already has is transparency requirements and safeguards that apply where solely automated decision-making is permitted. So in those situations, you have certain rights around about being able to ask for a human to make the decision rather than a computer, and the right to contest that decision, and also certain information rights around about the existence of the automated decision-making and how that decision has been reached. And what's happening under the Data Use and Access Bill in Clause 80 is that will mean that the current restriction against solely automated decision-making will only apply where decisions are taken using special category data. So that's certain sensitive types of data, such as sort of sexual orientation, trade union membership, but there's lots of things that aren't covered by special category data. So the really key concern with this is that a chunk of decisions, so decisions that are taken not using special category data, will no longer be subject to that limitation. So more decisions will be allowed than are currently allowed. And in the government's impact assessment for the bill, they note that there is a risk associated with decisions of this type of discrimination and bias. And they say that this is mitigated by the fact that they're retaining the limitation for special category data. The reason why that's a concern is that special category data, first of all, doesn't capture all protected characteristics. There's lots of protected characteristics that fall outside of special category data. But also, it's perfectly possible for harmful or discriminatory decisions to be taken using non-special category data. And there are real-life examples of that. So the A-level scandal, for example, which most people are familiar with, didn't involve special category data. Similarly, there is a high-profile Dutch welfare benefits automated fraud decision-making scandal, which again used quite innocuous data sets like people's water bills, but because of how those could be used as proxies for things, resulted in discrimination in terms of how that tool was operating. And also, discrimination, although a key concern, isn't the only harm and concern as to why you might want a human in the loop. And I think it's important to note with this that sort of we don't think that having a human in the loop somewhere is necessarily a panacea. There's lots of reasons why that might not always act as a suitable check, but it's currently one of the main mitigating measures that are put forward by government when they're introducing new tools. So real life examples of that is the DWP's proposed eligibility verification measure, which is currently being brought forward in another piece of legislation, which is often referred to as the bank surveillance powers, where one of the key things that are put forward by DWP for people not to, as to why the concerns about that are being mitigated, is round about the fact that there'll be a human who will be involved in making that decision. And the concern is that if these proposals go forward, that one of the current sort of requirements that makes that the case will no longer be the case in terms of the law. The other bit to note round about Clause 80 is that, and this is one of the potentially positive things in terms of what's in the bill, is that it does now explicitly set out that what constitutes solely automated decision-making must be meaningful human involvement. So as I said before, that is something that was in guidance before and was pretty well accepted, but it does mean that it's baked into the legislation. And the important bit of that word is meaningful. So making sure that you can't just have somebody come in and do sort of rubber stamp a decision, but not actually be meaningfully involved in making that decision. But then what's concerning about it is what Mariana was touching on at the beginning, which is this provision in the legislation for the Secretary of State to then change the definition of meaningful human involvement by way of secondary legislation. And there's also provision for them to vary the definition of what constitutes a decision with similarly significant effect. And the reason why those are both quite important terms, which, if sort of varied in a way which waters them down, has the risk of further weakening the protections round about Article 22. There's lots of concern from predating the current government about overuse of secondary legislation to make significant policy changes. The key concern being if you pop this stuff into secondary legislation, it receives much less scrutiny. So one of the key stats around about this is that since June 2022, June 2022, only 16 statutory instruments, so secondary legislation, have ever been rejected by Parliament since 1950, and none have been rejected since 1979. So the concern is that going forward, the Secretary of State will be able to vary these terms with a lack of scrutiny by Parliament. And then, sort of last but not least, is the other thing that the bill is set out as doing is that it's setting out a set of safeguards that should apply where solely automated decisions are being taken. So that includes decisions which are made using non-special category data. And there's also provision for those to be varied by way of regulation. So that's been put forward by government as a positive thing. They've said that that's about sort of being clearer and they're implying that it's about strengthening the safeguards. But in actuality, in terms of what's set out in the bill, they don't seem to really go further than what's already there and are potentially in some cases less clear and less specific. But more concerningly, it's also a bit of a missed opportunity. So there are a number of things in terms of the existing safeguards that are in place in the GDPR, which could be clarified and could be tightened up, which haven't been addressed through the current bill. And one of the key ones round about that is the need to give people individual notice that when a decision has been taken about them, so that where an automated decision has been taken, which has affected your rights, that you get something which very clearly tells you that that's the case and gives you an explanation as to how that decision was taken, which is the kind of information that is really important for people if they then want to go on to challenge that decision. So in summary, 3 key things to note from from Clause 80 on automated decision making. The first is it's taking out a big chunk of decisions from the existing limitations on solely automated decision making. So more decisions will be able to be taken without a human being involved, so being taken entirely by a computer. It also currently allows variation of 2 quite significant definitions by way of secondary legislation, so with limited scrutiny. And it also risks being a bit of a missed opportunity to clarify some of the safeguards. And some of the amendments that we are suggesting that lawmakers put forward, parliamentarians put forward, will be around about how you can strengthen some of those safeguards. I'm happy to take questions at the end. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Caroline. You really concisely covered what can be quite a complicated subject once you get into the kind of nitty-gritty of how GDPR works there, the changes in automated decision making, but you did it really clearly with those slides as well. So hopefully everyone's now got a much better understanding of what's actually been proposed there in the bill. And this is, one of the topics that we're doing some public campaigning on. So we have got a 38 degrees petition on it that's been shared to chat. So please do kind of sign and share that with your friends and family and let people know about it. I mean, I'd say personally, I'm one of all these people who, things always tend to go wrong for me with bureaucracies when I apply for things, or I always end up getting lost in systems. So the idea that, more of that's going to be done by AI or automated, and I'm going to have less of ability to challenge things kind of worries that I'll end up getting stuck in some kind of Kafkaesque nightmare with. So I think, and as you said, there's plenty of examples where this has gone wrong with some big scandals in the past, and I think potentially it's one of those things that might pass quite quietly in a bill, then 5 years down the line we've got the next Horizon type scandal, and this has been a role in facilitating that. So really important topic for you to cover. Thanks for that. and I'm sure there'll be some questions at the end. Now, last but not least, in terms of our speaker, we've got Martin from Keep Our NHS Public. So I'm just going to add the spotlight to Martin and hand over to you, Martin.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sharing screen, am I? No, hold on. Here we go.
Up now, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Let me just slideshow, play from start. Okay, that's great. Just before I start, I would like to thank Jan Savage for all her work on this subject. KOMP has a range of concerns about the DUA bill, not least the considerable power the bill gives to the Secretary of State to create new rules by secondary legislation. However, our focus here is the implications of the bill for the NHS, patients, and our data. Certain types of information, such as biometric data and that revealing racial or ethnic origin, are seen to merit extra legal protection because they are likely to be sensitive and could create risks to an individual's rights and freedoms. The existing GDPR sets out a comprehensive list of such special categories of data where processing is prohibited unless certain conditions are met. However, in medicine, new technologies are changing the nature of personal data. NHS England and others propose that healthcare should be more preventative and personalised, based on a detailed understanding of each patient and their health risks. Encouragement for this has come from private companies such as Ernst & Young and institutes such as Tony Blair's, which predict that the NHS, through personalised medicine, can unlock significant operational savings and enhance patient outcomes and disease prevention, alongside wider economic benefits through increased opportunities for the private sector to develop new products and services. These changes require new types of personal data, such as genomics from our DNA and metabolomics, that is, the metabolic signatures in body fluids and tissues affected by our genetics, epigenetics, environment, diet, and behavior. With both, the aim is to evaluate health and predict disease risk. In combination with electronic patient records, they create an unprecedented intimate detail, such as required to tailor treatments. As the Ada Lovelace Foundation points out, this new data brings ethical and legal challenges, especially given that value extraction from it increasingly involves AI. Another major concern is AI's use to make complex decisions about value in healthcare itself, at a time when preventative and personalised approaches are expected to reduce future healthcare demand and costs in an environment of constrained public budgets, and where patient groups or individuals whose treatment is deemed to be of lower value may lose out. It is these complex evaluations being determined by some opaque AI and without patients' knowledge that Kingsley Manning, the retired chair of NHS Digital, warned us about when he wrote to the BMJ in 2022. The last Conservative government's life sciences industrial strategy called for active NHS engagement with commercial innovators and created a new body, the Centre for Improving Data Collaboration, to support NHS organisations to enter into data access agreements with researchers and commercial partners. The Centre offers help with data valuation and the development of reimbursement models. Data is not sold as such, but commercial returns can include payment for access, royalties, equity shares, or shared intellectual property ownership of products. But the underlying ethos is that the data users' interests take priority, with patients' pseudonymized personal data released to researchers, external organizations, and commercial companies at pace and as default. To further aid data sharing, the recent Sudlow review recommends a single national health data service to champion the rationale and a mechanism to extend a legal gateway, such as the emergency powers created during COVID-19. This is for rapid access to necessary health data and includes an acceptable, transparent investment strategy for health data infrastructure and models for data access, cost recovery, and pricing. Professor Sudlow, while indicating that discussions have already happened widely about such cost models, admits that the idea of large multinational companies profiting off the back of the NHS is not palatable for many people, and the notion of direct data selling doesn't go down well with the public. Current legislation provides for the processing of personal data for research and includes scientific research, which, while not defined, is understood to be what is carried out in traditional academic and commercial settings and for technological development. There are certain rights people have to restrict the use of their personal data by an organization, and these rights can be ignored in certain circumstances when data is used for scientific research. Such circumstances could be that restriction will adversely affect the research outcomes and deny possible future benefit. The DUA bill proposes to amend the GDPR so that scientific research will mean any research that can reasonably be described as scientific, whether publicly or privately funded, and whether or not it is a commercial activity. This vagueness, in effect, extends what research is scientific and may allow more exemptions to be applied to deny people's rights. The House of Lords, while concerned about lack of transparency over the use of AI systems for processing personal data, also expressed fears that broadening the definition of scientific research could encourage private AI companies to create data-driven products under the guise of scientific research. While patient consent is assumed for information sharing between clinicians involved in direct care, it is usual for research purposes to obtain explicit consent from participants. The GDPR stipulates that this consent means offering individuals real choice and control and requires a positive opt-in. Also, currently, when a researcher intends to reuse personal health data for a purpose beyond the original reason for consent, they must provide additional information to the participant or apply to the confidentiality advisory group for permission. However, the bill extends the definition so that consent for one purpose can include consent for future research, even if at the time of consent, the future purpose of research is unknown. Data subjects will not need to be informed of additional use of their data if this involves a disproportionate effort for the researchers. What constitutes disproportionate effort is ultimately subjective and a backward step in terms of transparency that runs counter to ICO guidance, stating that consent is only valid if the data subject can withdraw it at any time, which of course is impossible to do if you are completely unaware how your data is going to be put to use. While these amendments give organizations more flexibility to respond to change as research programs develop, they run completely counter to the ICO's call for transparency on how personal data is used. And the Lords Constitution Committee reiterated how much data protection is a matter of great importance in maintaining a relationship of trust between the state and the individual. So the power to use personal data should not become so broad as to unduly limit the rights of the individual. Now, you've heard a lot about ADM already, but just briefly, automated decision-making and profiling have huge implications for patient care if they are used in triage decision-making patient risk assessments, and the allocation of resources. The bill empowers the Secretary of State to set aside or amend safeguards in the use of ADM provided by the GDPR and to regulate so that they can decide whether a particular decision had meaningful human involvement or not. The British Medical Association emphasises the risk that these powers create of decisions being made on political grounds that could have a significant negative impact on some patient groups, especially where ADM is used to decide resource allocation and when funding of services favours certain patient groups or geographical areas at the expense of others. Studies show that the public are willing for their data to be used for the public good, but far less keen for it to be used for profit. Also, the public want data-driven innovation, but expect it to be for public benefit, responsible, ethical, and properly regulated. Data security is a potential casualty as the commercial value of NHS data grows and tech companies require access to massive data sets in the race to build AI. Anecdotally, there appears to be little transparency on data use, in that privacy notices meant to inform patients about use of their data are not readily accessible, nor easily understandable. There have been major breaches of NHS data use on the part of companies and others. In 2022, the BMJ uncovered major failures by the NHS in complying with the agreed terms for use of data received from NHS Digital. It was suggested that these findings were but a glimpse of all the failures of NHS data policy and practice over a decade, creating a steady drip that over time erodes public perceptions that the NHS is a trustworthy steward of our data. The bill, by secretly increasing access to NHS data, and especially to private companies, may erode that trust even further. The ICO has a range of legal powers to use against the abuse of data, but according to the Open Rights Group, the ICO has only issued 4 data protection law related fines to private companies in the last financial year, and for some reason seems to be particularly reluctant to take any action against public sector bodies. Thank you. Thank you for listening, and I will also be very happy to try and answer questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Martin. Really, really useful. And the NHS part of it is huge as we start to consider, the real world implications of this bill and what it will mean for kind of services that we all rely on so much. So we've got some time now for questions. We've got to about 8:30, so hopefully we'll get a chance to ask, get through a few of them. So if people want to kind of use the question answer facility within Zoom to start asking them, then I'll kind of bring in panel members and hopefully we can get through any questions you might have about that. So don't be shy. Feel free to kind of type away and ask those. In the meantime, while people start to think about their questions, just a few other things, around this bill generally. Obviously, this bill is a bit unusual in that it started in the House of Lords, and many of the members of the House of Lords probably felt like they've been debating these data protection issues for quite some time because the previous, data protection bill had been in the Lords. It's now just come into the Commons, so it had its second reading last week, and it's going into a public bill committee stage where people can submit evidence to that bill committee. Now, the point we're making, this is really the first time this new Parliament has had a chance to consider these issues. It is a new Parliament, people recently elected to that, so we do think MPs should give this proper consideration. And so now is the time, I guess, to get kind of campaigning, engaging with your MPs and those politicians that represent us around these issues. And that leads nicely into the first question, which is from Rose, J Rose. It says, apart from signing petitions, what else can we, the public, do? So I'll throw that open to the panel if they've got any suggestions. I've got a few ideas myself, but I'll what else could someone do? that want to hop in?
I mean, this isn't a something else, but I think I know that petitions and writing to MPs can feel a bit like futile or liking on social media or something. But I do actually think it's quite important in this because I think one of the real challenges with like the data bill is like it's not a very sexy topic. It's quite difficult to explain it to people. It can seem really dry. And I think what is really important is for parliamentarians to feel like it is something that there are people out there that do care about it. So while I think petitions, it might feel like it's not a big act, I think it's actually quite important. So it is helpful if you're putting your name to it, if that makes sense.
Great. Thanks, Caroline. In chat, we've shared as well a Google Doc that's been created. So there's a kind of a group of UK civil society organisations that are working on some of the issues around the bill. We've all got our own views on it, but we're all kind of coming together to kind of talk about things and share ideas. And together we've created this Google Doc as a shared resource that talks through some of the issues in the bill and has some useful links where you can go and find out more information. So I think one thing you could do is kind of have a read of that, find out a bit more about it, and then, you know, if you want to do some campaigning on it, then use our tool, write to your MP, try and even, you know, meet your MP in person, maybe write a letter to your local paper about the issue. There's lots of stuff in the bill which is really important, as we've heard this evening, whether it's impact on policing, you know, the ICO issue of enforcement. We get lots of people all the time contacting us at org, and they've had some problem and the ICO hasn't been able to resolve it for them, and that may be, you know, workplace disputes. It could be victims of online stalking who've had data wrongly shared. So it does have this kind of real world impact when these things aren't working. So Martin, you've got something as well.
Can I say the same for KOMP? If you are concerned about the way that data is going to affect care, and the way that care is being, you know, taken away from human beings, really, in many respects, decisions will be made. It's possible that many professional skills will be downgraded as artificial intelligence is used and added to the you know, the possibility, and they wish to reduce the cost of healthcare, and this is the way, this sort of tech solutionism is the way that they see as going forward. So please go and look at the KOMP website, go and look at the data working group part of that, and there are a lot of briefings on that, and there's also letters that you can send to MPs, partly produced so that you can use them as a basis to write. As many people as possible should do that. And we think also the House of Lords is a very good place to push, because they seem to be more aware. That perhaps more of them were around at the same time as the last bill was going through, so they've heard a lot of the arguments before, perhaps, but they seem to be more aware of the problems that this is going to all cause.
Great. Thanks, Martin. So yeah, it's another recommendation there. Go and have a look on Keep Our NHS public website as well, and look at some of their letter tools. So hopefully that answers your question. I'll do a little bit more of a pitch at the end, just a reminder of things that people can do. So next question I've got from Anne Hargreaves, and it's referring to the EU UK adequacy decision. Is this likely to depend on some extent the UK stance vis-a-vis UK US data transfers? So I don't know, Mariano, you'll probably
yeah, I guess that's I mean, I would say I don't necessarily think that's something that's going to come into play, because at least as the framework stands right now, what we do have is an adequacy decision between the EU and the United States, the data protection framework, and we have an extension of that framework to the United Kingdom. So the let's say, like, the bottom line is the moment this framework, the frameworks to the US fall, and it might very well fall at this point, because well, really for similar reasons to the one we're discussing about the United Kingdom. Trump has fired all the Democratic appointees of the Privacy and Civil Liberty Oversight Board. That was the U.S. independent supposedly independent data protection authority that was meant to oversee the functioning of this agreement between the EU and the US. And in general, a lot of the safeguards that were laid in the US were laid through executive orders. And here there is a problem related to Trump revoking many of these executive orders, but also with the fact that the president can always override an executive order also in secret. So there is a problem of is an executive order a real safeguard against surveillance for national security purposes in the United States. And but I mean, bottom line is when the data protection framework goes down, we kind of know that it will go down because, if it's not a commission to bring it down, there is already a judicial challenge which is being brought forward in Austria about this. And eventually the Court of Justice will have to fundamentally invalidate the decision. The UK extension goes down automatically because it's an extension. And so if let's say the root goes down, also the leaf goes down with it. I think there is a broader issue in terms of where the UK does see themselves fit, because the issue that you're seeing right now is that the UK is really kind of trying to side with the United States in terms of tech policy, tech developments. They're having this AI everywhere, data centers everywhere sort of, and deregulation everywhere sort of approach, in a moment where they're also trying to build relationships with the European Union and further cooperation with them and so forth. But the European Union is very at stake with the United States, and they're trying to get what they call strategic independence. So basically, decouple themselves from internet services from the United States. And together with this, they're generally speaking, the fact that technology is starting to be leveraged by the United States as an instrument of political power, right? You do have J.D. Vance, the vice president, that recently went to an AI safety summit in Paris and said pretty clearly, we are here to tell you that we don't want to discuss with you about AI. We are here to, give you AI and to dominate you through AI. And, problem of this is the Europeans maybe don't want to buy something that enslaves them. But, the bottom line is, yes, if the UK takes the side of the US on the matter, then it's difficult to see how they can sustain the wish that they expressed about keeping on with cooperating with the European Union. And I think this is probably a bigger issue on the equation here.
Mm.
Thanks for that. If people got any other questions, feel free to put them through and we'll get around to that. I mean, one thing I was kind of thinking with this bill, I've been looking at what's happening in international affairs at the moment. There's all this controversy over in the United States around how Musk's kind of dodge team has been set up within the US government and is now starting to apply whatever software that he's using to kind of go through and find supposedly examples of government waste. And it got me thinking there around what could happen in the UK in the future. There are politicians who've suggested we need a kind of UK version of Dodge. So I wondered, really, a question that I could put to the panel is how could you imagine if you were with ill content and you wanted to kind of get additional power and you wanted to rush through a load of things, how could you use the data bill to really kind of aid you in that? So if you can imagine, what could be some of the negative impacts of this bill if it were to be in the hands of a future administration that didn't care about, kind of due democratic process or our data rights, or they didn't care about how police powers impacted these marginalized communities. So it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that, and we'll go on to a few more questions.
Sort of like that, but can I just, our health service is now has its digital infrastructure supplied by big tech, which means that all the data has been encouraged by the NHS to go onto cloud. And the plan is that the NHS is to be formed into what they call learning systems, 42 learning systems, totally dependent upon tech and the analysis of that tech and the creation of innovation. And I don't know whether any of you are aware of how cloud works and how big tech monopolizes innovation and extracts enormous amounts of wealth. Now, as far as I'm aware, that the general public haven't been told that big tech were going to provide the infrastructure of the NHS and that innovation was going to be done on their clouds. There's a big literature about this coming out of UCL and Europe. TNI have been going on about big tech and the fact that big tech have practiced something called data colonialism across the whole of the global south and have taken control of the WTO and have stolen human data across the global south and locked it into their systems. And it's, and the whole thing about big tech and the NHS just seems to have happened and nobody knows about it.
Thanks,
And
Mark.
if I were, that is one way that they can actually start to get control. And I believe they're also in big tech supplies cloud for British government, doesn't it? I believe.
I think there have been other cases. I can't remember who it was. I want to say Police Scotland. I might be wrong, but I think there was another case of kind of UK public authorities that were storing data on US based kind of cloud services. Although my understanding is that most of the UK government's cloud infrastructure should be on kind of UK or EU servers. But someone might correct me on that, or I might well be wrong. So don't quote me on that. But it's a really important point about where that data is stored, who then has access to it, and under kind of what jurisdiction. So moving on to just to kind of bring in some of the other panelists. Hope you're talking about in your talk about how you work with communities that are fearful of the police already and their powers. So how do you think, what would be kind of worst case scenario of some of this stuff where a future authoritarian government gets into power, police can now look at anyone's records they want, what kind of things, not to be too alarmist, but we do have to, I think in this current day and age, we have to be pretty serious and consider the rise of the far right across Europe and in the US, how these powers could be misused.
Yeah, I think it's an important question. I think for me, this government is authoritarian enough. Like we talk a lot about the rise of the far right, but I think if we look at Labour's record so far as a government, it's not a particularly left-wing government. And we've had record numbers of deportations already. We're looking at a new crime and policing bill coming in later this year, which seems to be looking at the causes of crime and harm, or not looking at the causes, but looking at the kind of symptoms and looking at tougher policing and that strategy around surveillance and criminalization as opposed to community care. We're in a position where we're looking at communities asking for more money, more funding for community resources. We're in an ongoing cost of living crises, and people are like crying out for actual support for that to just live basic lives, and instead, rather than putting money into that, we're seeing money invested into tougher policing on the poorest and most marginalized. So I think I'd say we're already there in terms of the dangerous potential uses of some of this legislation. But I think, in terms of what is the worst case scenarios, I think it's important that when we're talking about data, it can get kind of hypothetical or kind of theoretical, and it can feel like we're not talking about real people. And I guess that's our job as people who are working on these kind of topics is to highlight that when we talk about, police use of data, for example, we're not just talking about numbers and spreadsheets. We're talking about things that can lead to people being evicted from their houses, people being kicked out of schools. The data and information on people is used to have real life consequences, and we see it happen all the time. So I think it's trying to look at the fact that if the police are using your data against you, it can have really serious consequences. It can lead to criminal convictions. It can lead to being kicked out of housing. It can lead to not being able to get a driving license, these kinds of things. So I guess that's why there's such a concern around having less restriction on that and more ability to share and access data because of these real life implications.
Thanks for that, Hope. Then I'll just bring Caroline in on this kind of question. Okay, automated decision making. There's some safeguards in it, and then ministers have got extra powers; they could define it. But Chris Bryant, I think when you hear him, he's been talking at second reading around his desire to kind of set that, and he mentioned about bringing in the kind of meaningful human involvement. What would be your worst fear of a future government, how they could change that automated decision making? How easy would that be to do in practice? Because they still have to do a secretary instrument, right? So they can't just do it without any process.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of saving grace on the meaningful human involvement is that it does have meaningful human involvement now. And so the word meaningful is in there, which I guess provides a little bit of a check. But like I say, that concern is that what you can then do in a quite an unaccountable way is really weaken that down until it's coming much closer to something which is just a rubber stamp. And I guess in terms of kind of like the consequences of that, if you look at, so I mentioned some of the examples of where things had gone wrong in my presentation, but things like robo-debt in Australia that people might have heard of, where huge numbers of people were impacted by an incorrect algorithm for identifying overpayments and debts in terms of welfare rights. The recommendations that came out of the inquiry that resulted from that was about trying to do things a bit like Article 22, whereas we've got something going in the other direction. And again, if you look at the kind of the results of the inquiry, there's the stuff about how the tool operated and where it went wrong. But one of the really kind of key things that they chose to highlight in the introduction of it was about the danger that happens when essentially politicians put going after a narrative around about essentially scroungers and fraud and inflating concerns about fraud, and that obscuring sort of important concerns about what was lawful and discriminatory in terms of how things were then operating. And I guess the concern is when you look across to the UK with another piece of legislation which is going through at the moment in terms of the Fraud, Error and Recovery Bill, where again there's that desire to really choose to prioritise and focus putting the onus on going after fraud, but where the thing that's being put forward is, but we will have a human in there that will provide a check. That check isn't in that legislation. So if you then take away the restriction in Article 22, there's that risk that, again, it becomes much easier for fully automated things to be rolled out without at least having that check in there, which is one of the sort of concerns with it.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm going to move over now to a question from David Bishop. Now, David has asked on the thoughts of a panel on the Bill's reliance on a list of certain recognised legitimate interests, which he says is Annex 1, Schedule 4. So test of your bill knowledge there. And he says, where a legitimate interest assessment wouldn't be required, does this bring much needed clarity to controllers and free up their time to focus on more important areas of data protection? Or is it just a further erosion of a data controller's obligations to balance their interests against individuals' rights? So maybe a little bit of a technical. If Mariano's smiling, I think, do you want to hop in with that, Mariano?
Okay, I guess a useful starting point is what is a legitimate interest. Legitimate interest is a legal basis that is meant to include some flexibility in the GDPR, and is meant to allow the processing of personal data for reasons which are not consent or contract, or because there is a public authority with a vested power in doing so, or vital interest. which are the older legal basis. And in theory, legitimate interest means anything, right? I mean, like making money is a legitimate interest. I mean, like anything that is not explicitly or outstandingly illegal is, generally speaking, something that you might legitimately be interested into. However, of course, there is a problem of whenever you're processing personal data, you're interfering with the right to privacy and to data protection of that individual. And you are exposing them to potential risk about this. So the legitimate interest test is meant to exactly create a situation where you can't use a legitimate interest as a way to just do whatever you want with the data. You have to create a balance where on the one hand you put what you're doing, what you're trying to achieve, and on the other hand you measure this against the potential impact that what you're doing may have on an individual. And on this basis, you look whether you're exposing somebody to a risk that is, and whether this risk is justified or not. How does this work in practice? I mean, I guess a very academic example is, let's say, if you go to a hospital, you know, like, and let's say you're a woman, you've been beaten up, and you know, like, let's say the staff of the hospital might suspect that you are a victim of domestic abuse. Now, there are, I mean, like, reporting a domestic abuse is potentially legitimate interest. However, usually what we have accepted is that we're not doing this unless there is the consent of the victim, because reporting this may actually expose the person to further harm. And you know, like, if you take this away, it means that simply you take the agency away from the victim, and it means that now it's up to the hospital to decide whether they're going to report this to the authority or not. Another example in this regard, and maybe it's more, you know, like a UK specific, is say you go to a hospital, and the moment you get admitted, people send this information to the immigration enforcement, you know, so some immigration enforcers to check whether you have the right to live in the UK. Now, this is also something that in Europe is, generally speaking, prohibited for the obvious reasons that if you start doing this, you will exclude a part of the population from healthcare services, because people will be fearful of going to a healthcare services and potentially being flagged to the Home Office and potentially being deported because they try to look for, you know, like healthcare services. And this is, of course, a problem because then you start having a part of the population that he's an hazard, basically, because, you know, like, they might be diseased, they might have medical conditions, and if they don't cure them, this is a problem for everyone. So, I mean, this kind of explains you a little how this works. And the bottom line is what the government are doing is to take this legitimate interest assessment away. So all of a sudden, whenever the government decides that you can process some data for a given purpose, say prevention of crime or national security or safeguarding or so forth, now the default is exactly we share this data and it is legal to share this data. And because this is not only a list, this is also a power, a regulatory making power that the Secretary of State has to add whatever purpose they want to the list. This means that this can grow over time, and in turn, it means that fundamentally you stop having a right to data protection every time, or you have a slightly less data protection every time the government decides to add a voice to the list. And does it bring clarity? I mean, like, it brings clarity in terms that it allows private enterprises to just abuse your data and get away with this because, you know, now it's legal to do it, but this is not probably the kind of clarity that you would like to have for, you know, I guess, yeah. So this is it.
Thanks, that Mariano. And I've posted, you know, that I think clause 70 of the bill on lawfulness of processing, where it gives the power of the Secretary of State to amend that list of recognised legitimate interests through secondary legislation, and this is really the kind of Henry VIII powers in the bill that we've been warning about. Now, one example Open Rights Group has used of this is in the previous Data Protection Digital Information Bill, there are clauses around political party use of data. And it could be the case in the future that a Secretary of State could, identify political parties having further use of voter data or obtaining data from commercial sources such as Experian or other kind of data brokers as a recognized legitimate interest of a political party to do that. And they could even do this 6 months out of an election, or they could even have a plan to do this which the other parties weren't aware of until that secondary statutory instrument is laid before Parliament. And it could be done at such a speed that the Electoral Commission and the ICO wouldn't have real time to write guidance ahead of that before an election. So this is what kind of worries me around this bill is in a benign person or a benign Secretary of State's hands, you could see how that power could possibly be used to add some clarity to data controllers, and they may be very sensible as to what they say is a recognised legitimate interest. But if it were in someone's hand who had ill intent and was looking to kind of rig the system and rig power in their favour, then I think there's a lot of potential for abuse of those clauses around recognised legitimate interest. So hopefully that answers your question there, David. As far as I can see, we've got 9 minutes left, so we're kind of coming to the end of questions. I can't see that anyone else has asked one. So what I'll do maybe is just go round the panel and just give people a chance to do any kind of summing up remarks or any other points about the bill which they feel they may not have been able to cover yet. So I'll start in reverse order. Martin, is there anything else you want to add before we close the session up today?
I really think that the NHS is under great threat in terms of control and of tech companies embedding themselves within it, private tech companies embedding themselves in it, and probably controlling the innovation process and using NHS data in order, as a brand, in order to sell tech that's developed globally. And they're looking at the global market, and that we are, in our pretense to want to become a superpower, we are going to be used by them, certainly in the healthcare sector, for their ambition, which is to control a global healthcare market. And I think it's something that we need to be aware of and act against. And of course, if they control innovations, then it's not necessarily for our benefit, it's for their investors' benefit.
Thanks, Martin. I mean, I think when you see some of the companies involved in some of this stuff, when you look at the likes of Palantir, for example, and their involvement in our health data and their kind of links to the US administration, it does kind of give you pause, or it should give everyone pause for thought on this stuff. But
big tech have enormous contact with American defense and security services, and also the military. And Palantir, they form the infrastructure in NHSE's platform that Palantir sits on.
Yeah. Hope, is there anything you'd like to add before we end the session?
Nothing new particularly. Yeah, thank you to all my fellow panelists as well. It's really interesting to hear. But I guess I would just finish on when we're talking about, I guess, regulations around police use of data, just that the current safeguards we already have are like very small and don't work that well. I think that just anything that is going to make it even less regulated is concerning. And I would also say that if anyone's interested, particularly in policing and data, Amnesty are launching a report tomorrow about predictive policing, which will include lots of stuff about how data sharing is dangerous in regards to policing. So I'd recommend checking that out as well.
That's great, thank you. And if we want to find out more about your organisation, you've got a website or?
Yes, with the Forefront Project on most social media and online. Yeah, so you can find us there for more information.
Great, so give Forefront Project a follow on social media, that would be appreciated. Caroline, anything from public law's perspective, any kind of additional points you want to make?
Not massive, but I guess just to note, we've talked a lot about the sort of regulation around about automated decision making, but one of the other key challenges we've had is just about a lack of transparency in terms of how things are being used at the moment. And just to, I guess, flag on that I mentioned at the beginning that we've got something called the Tracking Automated Government Database, which is our link of all the different things that we're aware of now, and that we're due to publish an update on either this week or next week. But just it can sometimes be a useful way of seeing the real life ways and how that things are being used now, which can be a good way of illustrating it beyond just kind of the techie bit in the legislation. So yeah, flag that.
That's fantastic. And are you going to be like pressuring government departments to do their haven't they got some kind of algorithm tracker, because they were promoting that?
So the 80 and part of our asks around about the bill is continuing to raise the non-compliance around about the algorithmic transparency recording standard, which is the government's hub that they have produced, which is where they're meant to be publishing standardized information about the tools that they're using, which again isn't perfect, but would be a big step forward in terms of transparency. There's starting to be a bit of a drip feed through onto that of different tools, but there's still a lot of things missing from it, including some of the ones that we're most concerned about. So we're continuing to try and keep a bit of a focus on trying to get government to actually comply with it and do what they said they would do in terms of publishing information on it.
Right, thank you. And Mariano, anything else to add?
I mean, I guess I can quickly talk about, there is always this rhetoric about we're deregulating in order to promote innovation, which is an interesting rhetoric, thinking about how, innovations have been adopted in our society, right? I mean, like think of, I don't know, something like cars, like there didn't used to be rules about how to use a car until we started to use them, and people started to die and cars started to crash, so we started to set some rules on the road so that people wouldn't kill each other. Like specifically when I'm thinking about artificial intelligence, like on the one hand you do have this rhetoric of we have to adopt this, jump into it, and everything is going to be amazing because the technology is amazing. But then on the one hand, by doing this, they're saying because the technology is so amazing, we're taking away your agency, and fundamentally we're doing this without your consent, which is an interesting statement, right? I mean, like if this is so amazing, why are they so scared about the possibility that you maybe will say no to artificial intelligence? Then if you look at artificial intelligence today, even in regards of what we're seeing commercially, right? I mean, like chatbots and image generation tools, etc. Like the one thing that really strikes about this technology, apart from the fact that nobody really wants it, like the first thing that you're gonna find about any, I don't know, like AI product that people try to sell you is how do I turn this off? And the first thing you're gonna notice apart from that is that, I mean, like what these tools produce is very average and is very crap in a way, like, I mean, they're gonna write a lot of text which is boring, which is average, which is fundamentally meaningless, except for the fact that it's like grammatically correct. You watch at the AI generated images or videos, there is terrible stuff, like, I mean, like the internet has been flooded by the junk that this thing is producing. And then for some reason, like we have the government saying, well, now we're going to take this technology and use it to decide whether you're creditworthy or whether you're a fraudster. And all of a sudden, like this technology that does all the junk is going to work perfectly, and there is going to be no problem about this. I beg to differ, in my opinion. Like I don't think this thing is going to work very well. And I think that if you start looking at instances like, well, some of the ones that the Public Law Project was mentioning before, about how using AI has just resulted in things blowing up. This probably tells you that the technology isn't ready for doing this, and forcing people to adopt this and to be subject to this technology against their will isn't going to help its adoption. On the other hand, it's just going to create a lot of victims and a lot of pushback in the long term. So this is my last reflection.
Thank you so much, Mariana. Really appreciated. I sometimes wonder and reflect if in a few years' time we'll all be arguing that we need more face-to-face human decisions, and because we've got a loneliness epidemic and people don't interact anymore, and we'll all be arguing to go back to like post office counters and actual human interactions with public services. But we'll wait and see where this kind of supposed AI revolution leaves all of us. It's down to me, I think, as the chair, to thank all of the panelists for coming along to speak tonight. I always look forward to hearing all of you speak, and always learn something new. Even though I kind of do this day in, day out with my work at Org, there's always kind of something new and interesting to learn from this. So thank you so much for giving up your valuable time this evening to help engage with people, answer their questions. Thank you as well to everyone who's come along to listen to you. Hopefully you've learned something new as well. We will put the recording of this, will kind of go up on YouTube as soon as they've kind of processed the video, so it may be a little bit of a delay. Just in terms of a little bit of a plug for Open Rights Group, we are a membership organisation, so if you're not a member already, do consider giving to us regularly. We don't ask for any fixed amount, so we know times are tough for many people. Just anything you can give allows us to continue kind of putting on events like this for you. But I think more importantly, even than kind of joining Org, is to kind of go away, listen to this, and take some kind of political action, even if that's speaking to your friends and family. Most people probably don't even know this bill's happening. There are actions you can take. Keep our NHS public. Someone posted, write to them as a website where you can contact your MP. We at Org produce these tools for you to engage your MP. So do go away from this session tonight, have a read of some of the background information, especially that that Google Doc that's been put together and shared. We'll try and put together an email. Can't promise you it will be tomorrow, but maybe next week we'll do a kind of follow-up email on the event, and we'll include some of the links that we've given in chat to you in that kind of follow-up email. So thanks ever so much. It's 8:32, so only 2 minutes over time, and on that note, I'll end the session this evening. Thank you.